يضيق خلقك. الحمد لله ما حد بياخذ منك رزقك. هدي وارتاح ثابر واطمح من حقك، بس بلاش العين. لا 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 ما تسوى الدنيا تضيق خلقك. الحمد لله ما حد بياخذ منك رزقك. هدي وارتاح ثابر واطمح من حقك، بس بلاش العين.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to ITV's Community Showcase. Today we're going to be focusing or showcasing rather a book written by Brother Shafiq Morton from Cape Town, entitled From the Spice Islands to Cape Town, taking us through the story of Tuan Guru. And for enlightenment on this, we ask Brother Shafiq Morton what inspired him to write this book.
Towards the end of 2017, I was approached by Mikhail Collier of S05 South Africa, and he had a request. Would I like to write a book about Tuan Guru? I said yes without hesitation, realizing that I was basically rushing in where many angels had feared to tread, because there was a shortage of information about Tuan Guru, and there were a lot of challenges that I had to meet in telling his life history. It is important that S05 South Africa have embraced this idea of leaders and legacies, because we have to get our history down before we start to forget it. When I started working on the Tuan Guru project, I actually realized that we knew very little about him. Great work had been done by people such as the late Dr. Ahmad Davids. Frank Bradlow in the early years had done some excellent research in trying to find out where the first mosque was and all the background to that, but there were huge gaps in the life and times of Tuan Guru. Then I discovered that he'd only arrived in Cape Town when he was 68 years of age. So what we had was that there were 68 years missing in his life history. And I thought, but it's not going to be a balanced narrative if I don't have a look at what his life was like, where he came from, which is called the Spice Islands in Indonesia. They call it the Moluccas or Maluku. And the island from which he came is a place called Tidore, very, very famous for the clove trade. And one of the reasons why the Dutch came to the Far East or the Southeast Asia was for the spices, particularly the cloves, which were grown on islands such as Tidore. And the Dutch arrived there in the early 17th century. So I had this challenge. I had to fill in 68 years, which I thought was going to be very important to put Tuan Guru into context, into what happened to him in Cape Town. But I didn't know where to start and I didn't know where to go. But fortunately what happened to me was that a Professor Michael Luffin from Princeton University was at the same time doing research on Tuan Guru. And he kindly pointed me in the right direction in terms of certain references. Then in late during the year, we had a visit from the Sultan and from one of Tuan Guru's descendants from Tidore. His name is Muhammad Amin Farooq, Secretaris, Muhammad Amin Farooq. And I was able to interview him at the town of Baru, at the site where Tuan Guru is buried, and he gave me some interesting insights into Tidore and into the lineage of Tuan Guru. So slowly but surely it started to gel. Then fortuitously I managed to find some references about Tidore, because very little research has been done about that island in the English language. But fortunately I managed to find a reference from Professor Leonard Andaya. So what was great about that is it was indigenous research. And Leonard Andaya opened up a universe of myth and legend about the Moluccas, about the Spice Islands, which started to give more and more context as to who exactly Tuan Guru was. So we asked the question, who was he? Where did he come from? His ancestors come from Hadramaut in Yemen, and they are directly related to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And what happened was the earliest ancestor of Tuan Guru traveled to Oman, and from Oman they traveled into the Indo-Pak subcontinent, and from there they traveled to Southeast Asia, to Java, where they were propagating Islam. And this is the course of several centuries. The most significant ancestor of Tuan Guru in Indonesia is somebody called Sunan Gunung Jati, Sharif Hidayatullah, who brought Islam to a section of Java, Cirebon and Banten. And he became the Sultan of those two territories during his lifetime. Sunan Gunung Jati actually lived to the age of 120 years, which is quite astounding. But he was regarded as one of the Wali Songo, which is the 9 founding saints of Indonesia, and he brought Islam to that part of Java. Now, Sunan Gunung Jati is a direct ancestor of Tuan Guru's family. So what happened was that in about 1646, one of the great-grandchildren of Sunan Gunung Jati was somebody called Habib Umar Rahmat al-Faruq. And he left Cirebon. We don't know why he left. The prominent reason he left is that to spread Islam. I suspect there could have been some political intrigue. He lands on the island of Ternate, which is right next door to Tidore, in 1646. In 1656, he lands on the island of Tidore, and because he is descended from the Prophet, and because he's a scholar, and because he's spreading Islam, he's treated with great honor by the Sultan of Tidore, who then gives him one of his daughters to marry. So what we have is Tuan Guru not only descended from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, but he also has a royal lineage in Indonesia. And from that marriage, we fast forward to somebody called Qadi Abdul Salam, who was Tuan Guru's father. Now, Qadi Abdul Salam, Qadi means religious judge, but in the Moluccas, in the Mulaku, a religious judge was also an ambassador, an advisor, so they played a very prominent political role. And Qadi Abdul Salam actually left Tidore and he went to one of the neighboring islands called Halmahera, and his grave is actually on that island. So what happens is that the Dutch have arrived in Southeast Asia, and they are harvesting the cloves, but they are not directly in control of all the territories, because the Dutch had to work to the various sultans to get to the cloves. They couldn't just come in and invade every single island, because there are 20,000 islands in Indonesia. So what happened was the Dutch would sort of make alliances with local sultans, and the sultans, realizing that they couldn't fight the Dutch, would have to fall for this. So what happened was that during the lifetime of Tuan Guru, the English started to arrive in Southeast Asia. Now, the English were not looking for cloves with any great intensity. They were actually more interested in the tea of India than cloves at that particular stage. But the Dutch saw the British as a great challenge and as a great enemy. And what happened was that the Sultan of Tidore sent an envoy to an Englishman called Thomas Forrest, who in the nearby Philippines had established a warehouse for trading. And now the other thing to remember is that Tidore, although it's a small island, had a small empire, and they governed and took taxes from neighboring islands far into the archipelago. So Tidore and Ternate, the two islands, were centers of power. Now the Dutch saw this envoy as a complete threat to their control. And what they did was they decided to break down the political power of Tidore and Ternate. And what they did was they exiled Tuan Guru and members of his family, the sultans of the two islands, to Batavia, to break up the power of the islands. And Tidore lost its status with the Dutch and became just a Dutch vassal to be exploited for its clove trade. So Tuan Guru came to Cape Town, I think, on a gross injustice. He was accused of conspiring with the English, but there's no evidence that they actually did, that the Sultan of Tidore was actually more looking for diplomatic relations, economic relations, than he was to undermine the Dutch at the time, although the people of Southeast Asia were not particularly fond of the Dutch. So what happens is Tuan Guru and some of his family members spend a little bit of time in Batavia, which in those days was an absolute hellhole. 50% of the people who arrived in Batavia, which is modern-day Jakarta, would die from malaria or dysentery. So in 1780, Tuan Guru and 4 members of his family are sent to the Cape. We get Tuan Guru, Imam Abdullah, there's Qadi Abdul Rauf or Kali Abdul Rauf. He was a Qadi. In fact, he was higher in rank than Tuan Guru. Nurul Iman, who was a scribe or secretaris, and Badruddin, who was also what they call a secretaris. So these were high-ranking political officials, learned people, sophisticated people, who found themselves on the boat, the Zeepaart, which left Batavia, and 70 days later, in the month of April, they arrive in Cape Town. And what is interesting about this is that Tuan Guru writes in a letter that we discovered during the writing of the book, and this letter is a completely new discovery about Tuan Guru, that he mentions being in Cape Town for 24 hours at the castle and then being sent to Robben Island. And on Robben Island is where the story really gets interesting, because Tuan Guru was not on Robben Island once, he was on the island twice. And after the break, I will very briefly explain what happened to Tuan Guru on the island and why he went there for a second time, and the legacy of this very, very great man and great scholar who I think should be given the freedom of the city of Cape Town.
Once again, talking about the book launch, or the book written by Brother Shafiq Morton, From the Spice Islands to Cape Town. We go for a break. When we come back, we look at the life of Tuan Guru when he arrived in Cape Town. Keep watching.
لا 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 ما تسوى الدنيا تضيق خلقك الحمد لله تافل وضح من حقك بس
Welcome back to ITV's Community Showcase, where we are once again focusing on the book launch of the book entitled From the Spice Islands to Cape Town, written by Brother Shafiq Morton. Before the break, we heard what inspired Shafiq to write this book. Now let's focus on the story of Tuan Guru when he arrived in Cape Town.
Now, Tuan Guru finds himself on Robben Island in the April of 1780. And there's several things we have to observe here. Remember, he's come from the tropics. He spent 68 years living in the tropics. Now imagine you come to Cape Town in April. Number one, the first fogs are coming in. It's much colder. You get the southeaster blowing you off the face of Robben Island, the northwester coming from the other direction. So you can imagine how traumatic it must have been for Tuan Guru and his family when they arrive in Cape Town and they get Cape Town weather. Apart from that, the food would be different. In fact, everything is different, apart from the trauma of exile and spending 70 days at sea in a Dutch Indiaman, not seeing much daylight and basically not knowing where they're going. So Tuan Guru is on Robben Island in 1780. I believe, and a lot of other scholars believe, that the first Quran that he wrote from his memory was written on Robben Island over about a year or so, because he's only on Robben Island for the first time for about a year, because in early 1781 the Dutch get news that the British are on their way via Commodore Johnston. So what the Dutch do is they think they're going to be clever, so they send the fleet of ships, their ships, to Saldanha. So they hide everything in Saldanha Bay. They take all the prisoners, convicts and soldiers off Robben Island. The convicts and the run-of-the-mill exiles, as it were, are sent to the slave lodge and to the hospital behind the slave lodge. But about 12 of the prominent exiles, including Tuan Guru and his party, and some princes from Ternate, are taken to Saldanha Bay with the Dutch. The ships hide there for a while, but the English get intelligence that the Dutch are hiding there, and then the English invade and they sink the ships and they take the ships away. Now Tuan Guru records this in this letter that he's written, which for some reason was never sent. The interesting thing is that what Tuan Guru says is also agreed to by the ship's log of Commodore Johnston. So we know that this happened 100%. It is interesting because two people in Tuan Guru's party escaped. Nuruddin and Qadi Abdul Rauf managed to get into a rowing boat together with members of the Taranaki royal family. They rowed up to Commodore Johnson's ship and begged for him to take them on board, which he did. And in the letter, Tuan Guru records that the last time he hears about them is that Qadi Abdul Rauf and his other person from his party are in Madras in India. And this is something which we've never heard before in terms of Cape Town history. But it gets more interesting here because now there's no ships, there's nothing. They can't get back to Cape Town. So Tuan Guru and the survivors of the battle with the English have to walk back to Cape Town from Saldanha Bay, now in May, June, the middle of winter. And he says it took them 15 days to get back to Cape Town in 1781. Now from 1781 to 1786, Tuan Guru starts to write another book. And this is called the Marifat wal Islam wal Iman, the book of faith and Islam. 613 pages from memory again. It deals with theological issues, Tawheed. It deals with sayings of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And in it he also has a lot of Sufi works and how to pray and basic instruction about religion. And what is interesting is that this book was used for 100 years after his death in the madrasas, in the schools of Cape Town. In 1786 he finishes this book. This is the evidence that we have. But something else happens in the same year. An ex-convict called Surabrata goes on a rampage and kills seven people in the streets of Cape Town. He does this because he's very angry. Now, why is he angry? He had served his time as a convict, and when he'd served his time, the Dutch had made him into a constable, which is dirty work in those days. He eventually felt, hang on, I've done my time, I now need to go home. So he approaches the authorities and they say, no, you must stay. And out of anger and homesickness, he goes on the rampage. In a sense, it's a suicidal mission because he knows he's going to be killed by the Dutch, which he is. It's his way of saying, up yours, and it's his way of like just finishing his life because life is not worth living if he can't go home. We underestimate how homesick the convicts and the exiles actually felt during the days of the Dutch time of being colonists. The Dutch were very cruel. And for example, when they captured Surabrata, who was dying from his wounds, they cut his hand off and they beat him in the face with his cut off hand while he was still alive. So, you know, I can go on forever talking about Dutch cruelty, but there's no time. But I think we get the message from that. Now, because of what Surabrata did and what some other escaped convicts did, the Dutch got very nervous about especially the political exiles because they had influence. So they sent them back to Robben Island for a second time. And Tuan Guru only comes off the island in 1791 for the second time. And it's from then on that he starts to rise to prominence as a community leader. Now, what was his contribution? Tuan Guru starts a school or a madrasa in Dorp Street, in the property of Sachi van der Kaap, one of the first free blacks, who's also one of the first free blacks to own property in South Africa and in Cape Town. The interesting thing is that his school starts off with more than 200 pupils. And by the time of Tuan Guru's death, it's nearly got 500 students at it. Now, what is significant about this school? The slaves and the convicts and the exiles had no education whatsoever. There was no educational facilities, no schools, no nothing for them. Tuan Guru started the first non-racial school in South Africa. He created the Rainbow Nation before we'd even thought of it. And why do I say this? The Muslim community at that time came from Madagascar. It came from Sri Lanka. It came from the Coromandel coast. It came from the Malabar coast. They came from East Africa. They came from West Africa, from Mozambique, from Southeast Asia, from all corners of the world. You had people gathered together in Cape Town, and Tuan Guru brought all these people from different parts of the world under one roof in his madrasa. And the colonial authorities noticed it because the benches of the Grote Kerk in the 1800s were empty. There were no slaves, no ex-convicts attending the Grote Kerk. They were all attending Tuan Guru's school. And when Tuan Guru's school had 400 students, SACS, or the University of Cape Town, could only boast 26 students. So that, in a sense, is part of the contribution that he made. His contribution, he was an educationist, he was a social activist, but he realized that by bringing people out of darkness, by giving them the light of education and giving them confidence through their faith, that he would be able to create a community that would be resilient and resistant to what the colonialists were basically throwing in their faces. He's also the pioneer of the Quranic tradition, the Hifz tradition, because he wrote a Quran from memory. In fact, he wrote 5 that were used to teach the community. He was also a leader because he created a hierarchy for the mosques. He had a Qadi, which for many years was him, the chief, as it were, of the community. Beneath him were the Imams, then the Khatibs, people who assisted the Imams, and then you had the Bilals, or those that would make the adhan for prayer. So this is a massive contribution. I mean, this is at a time when the colonial authorities couldn't give a fig for the condition of what was now becoming a Cape Muslim community. So Tuan Guru, that's why I say should be given the freedom of Cape Town. He created a community out of nothing, as it were, out of people who were traumatized, enslaved, who'd been hurt, who'd been divorced from their families for many years. He brought them together, yes, via faith, but via education, which was very important. And he created what today is the Cape Muslim community, which is one of the most cosmopolitan communities in the world. Go to any mosque on a Friday and you look at the faces of the people in the mosque, and you will see the faces of every single nation of the earth. And these are the faces of families that have been here for hundreds of years. And Tuan Guru, as I say, is, to my mind, one of the key historical figures in the city. You get Sheikh Yusuf of Makassar, who came here in 1694. The Khoi used to gather around him in Makassar. In 1699, most of his family goes back to Makassar. Who's after that? Tuan Guru comes here 1780. And if it wasn't for Tuan Guru, I don't think that we would have the vibrant, the variegated Muslim community that we have today. And it's been very exciting writing this book and discovering who Tuan Guru is and was in his fullest context. A man who introduced Quran to Cape Town, who introduced education, and who introduced the institution of the mosque. A sad thing about Tuan Guru, though, is that he couldn't carry on with his legacy. He died when he was 95 years of age in 1807. And one of his dying wishes was for his sons Shan and Abu Qasim to join him in Cape Town, because he knew that the community needed more people to educate them. It needed strong leadership. And without any disrespect to those who followed him, like Imam Ahmad van Bengalen, the sad thing was that Tuan Guru knew on his deathbed that our community in Cape Town would be beset by khilaf and arguments which were to characterize the 19th century until the arrival of Sheikh Abu Bakr Effendi in 1862. So to conclude about Tuan Guru, a giant, an absolute giant of South African history, underestimated, underappreciated, and undervalued. And hopefully, via this book, I can start the process of further investigation, further study, and a realization that Tuan Guru was without doubt one of the greats of our historical landscape.
Enlightening words by Brother Shafiq Morton when it comes to Tuan Guru. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it possible, inshallah, for all of us to read this book and know more of the rich history that is attached to Islam and Cape Town here in sunny South Africa. From myself and the rest of the team here, you are watching ITV's Community Showcase. Keep watching. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
لا 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 ما تسوى الدنيا تضيق خلقك، الحمد لله ما حد بياخذ منك رزقك، هدي وارتاح ثابر واطمح من حقك، بس بلاش العين. لا 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 منك رزقك، هدي وارتاح ثابر